Tierney from Chester, Connecticut. You are listening to ICRV Radio, the stream feeding the River Valley.
Hi, welcome to Archaeology of Connecticut. I'm your co-host, Scott Brady. This topic is one that I've been looking forward to. We're going to be discussing the Native American perspective on archaeology here in the state. And we have two distinguished guests. And without any other ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dan so we can get started.
Hello, everybody. This is Dan Forrest. Welcome to the September episode of the Archaeology of Connecticut. As a brief preface to the discussion today with our friends and colleagues today, I want to start by asking our listeners a basic question. We've been talking about the indigenous people of Connecticut and thousands of years of their history for several months now, and I'm curious, how many of you have wondered what are the descendants' perspectives on this? What are their thoughts? Do they think that we've done a good job? Are there topics that we haven't even touched on? And if you haven't thought about that, it's an interesting perspective and an understanding of what can be a very complicated relationship among archaeologists and among our indigenous friends. So as an introduction, that will serve. I also want to just make a couple of points before we dive in. There is no one indigenous perspective on archaeology. It's really important that everybody understand that. There are as many opinions, perspectives, and feelings about this as there are members of descendant communities. The other important point is that many tribes use archaeology themselves as part of their own education and preservation efforts. That archaeology can look quite different. And in many respects, the way in which that archaeology is done can be as important as what the archaeologists themselves often think of as results. So, based on that introduction, I'd like to actually introduce our guests today. We have Marissa Turnbull from the Mashantucket Pequot Tribal Nation, and we have James Quinn from the Mohegan Indian tribe as well. So, Marissa, if I can ask you to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Marissa Turnbull, and I am the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer as well as the NAGPRA Coordinator for the Mashantucket Pequot Tribal Nation.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is James Quinn. I'm the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Mohegan Tribe of Connecticut, and I also am the Archaeology Program Manager. And thank you for having me.
Melissa, could you, for the audience members that don't know, could you tell us what NAGPRA is? I think that's important.
Absolutely. So NAGPRA is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act.
And the responsibility of that is to help return items that have been removed back to the native indigenous people so that they can have decisions over how they're either reinterred or displayed.
Absolutely. NAGPRA is very important. It rests ultimately, to me, in regard to human rights of Native Americans and our ability to return our ancestors home to their location.
Thank you.
Okay, so both of you are Tribal Historic Preservation Officers. Can you tell us a little bit about what that means and what your responsibilities are for your respective tribes?
Sure. There are many facets to the role as a Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, so I'll boil it down to a few quick points about it. A large part of the work I do is identifying, documenting, inventorying, and then working to preserve sites of cultural and traditional significance to the Mohegan tribe on tribal lands. And also a big component of that is educational outreach to our membership, which we do by the way programming, written articles in our tribal newsletter, and things like that. A third and equally as important role that we have is conducting government-to-government consultation with federal agencies on federalized projects. These are projects located off Mohegan, quote-unquote Mohegan lands, but which are ancestral homelands to us. So these are lands that are no longer in our possession or not in trust or part of our reservation. So we work with actually local communities, state government, and federal government on large-scale projects in the region.
Marissa, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, so tribal historic preservation offices under the federal model, I would say, have many similar components that were just listed. So for our tribe, the identification of our historic properties, on-reservation and a lot of times off-reservation are a little bit more significant due to our history. Identifying those in order to protect the historic properties, education as well as a very large component of a tribal historic preservation office to utilize archaeology, for instance, and interpret that and then disseminate that information back to the community in a way that they can understand or a way that is important or understandable to the tribe as a whole.
Thank you. I think one of the threads that links a lot of the work that many archaeologists, non-Indigenous archaeologists, do in Connecticut, as well as the work that you're doing, is really that sort of education and outreach and engagement to help people understand the history of the people who've lived here before us, whether they were direct descendants of those individuals or other people who have lived here for many, many generations. I know both Mohegan and Pequot have used archaeology pretty extensively on your own reservations and off-reservation as well to understand aspects of your own history. Can you give us a brief summary of how that work has been conducted and what the future looks like?
Sure. I'll start with our current research. For the last decade or so, we've been investigating domestic households on the Mohegan Reservation. We think this is an important era, the post-colonial era, because I often think about our history as thought of in terms of the pre-colonial and colonial eras. So not much emphasis is placed, I think, on historical archaeology of Native people. So we've been dedicating a lot of our research for the past 10 years, mostly with our field school, which I can elaborate a little bit more on. But so we're looking at these households. We think the story is a lot more than just assimilation and receding into the background. So what we're finding is a great story of survivance and even renewal. So there's much more to the story than that kind of, just surviving and getting by. Native people are holding on to their traditions, holding on to their ways of life. And so we're seeing that in the archaeological record. And that's a hard thing to tease out, but what we believe is that because of our insight, because of our oral traditions, our oral histories, we have a little more perspective on these kind of things than maybe the non-Indigenous archaeologists may have. So that's kind of the current research we're doing. But we've had a field school for 23, 24 years now. So another big part of what we do is educating the non-native, student who wants to potentially become an archaeologist to create a more inclusive and ethical field and teach them the importance of working with descendant communities. So that's another big part of the work we do with our archaeology program.
Yeah, I'm fascinated with the idea that you're seeing that continuance of tradition, because, it doesn't. You don't have to look very hard to understand that was really discouraged by the European, the colonial settlers.
Right.
And I think that's a really important piece that needs to be, more people need to learn about that.
Right. What we're seeing is what we believe is a lot of these practices are being done in the safety of your home, where it's a lot safer to continue with the traditional ways of life and free from the outside view. So that's actually pretty accurate. Yeah.
Thanks. That's wonderful.
And Marissa, I know there's a rich history of archaeological work at Mashantucket as well.
Absolutely. The archaeology, I would say, at Mashantucket has been quite extensive. Mohegan has done an absolutely wonderful job of their archaeological program in merging two ways of knowledge, I would say, in that. For Mashantucket, I find that the great extent of the archaeology has been a result or a response to development. And so I find archaeological research being one thing and archaeology being done for development sometimes is another. The results that you come out with are different depending on how you begin in that area. For our tribe, the Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Research Center really had a great deal of archaeology involved in the planning process, and that was one of the hopes to bring to the public education surrounding Pequot history and culture. In our communities, a lot of our school children we know are taught very little about Pequot history. We generally have a paragraph or two on the Pequot War, and a lot of recent research, archaeological research, has been done in regard to the battlefield projects. And that has really helped, I would say, not only our tribal communities, but the public as a whole. When they are reading that information, they have additional information to go to expand their knowledge of that time period.
And this brings up another really important point, I think. We've talked a little bit about the work in southeastern Connecticut on tribal lands, but the connections for Pequot and Mohegan, as well as many other indigenous communities in this region, extend over a much larger area. And I think that can be something that's a little bit challenging for people who don't know the history or have not interacted very much, is to understand those sort of broader geographic and cultural connections. Is that something that you find in your work? Is that you're seeing connections, or you're already aware from oral tradition of a much broader geography?
Yeah, we come into it with a broader understanding of certain locations. We absolutely are aware that the reservation that was established in 1666, was just one of the land areas where we presided. And knowing that, we do have areas on the reservation that are significant, but the majority of our significant areas are very much off-reservation. Large battlefield locations are off the reservation, and the ability to protect those areas becomes a little challenging when the outside community may not necessarily be aware of those locations. And so archaeology can really assist in preserving those locations for us moving forward any areas off the reservation.
Yeah, for Mohegan, I guess it is a little bit different if you look at the history of how the reservation is developed. We're kind of still in the same area we've always been in. So a lot of our sites are still located on the current reservation. Although, after the Pequot War, you look at the map, I guess you would say, and Mohegan kind of takes over former Pequot lands, and so we certainly are finding a lot more about sites in, say, the upper northwest corner, or even the northeast corner, just throughout the state, really. And so that's been very helpful. And I think the Pequot War Battlefield Project's been very interesting, because if you look at the history between Mohegan and Pequot, obviously there's a kind of some conflict there, right? So, but it's been a great experience to be a part of that, and we've been working with that program and assisting with that program as well. So it's been a really just a great process. And so you bring in all the other actors in the Narragansett tribe, and and so you get a really more nuanced understanding of the Pequot War and all the players involved.
Yeah, and I think, even from my own experience in working with a number of the tribes in this region, that the unique perspectives that each bring, not just to what they should be done in research, but thinking about what questions should be asked, or what is important when we're looking at a landscape or a particular place. Those discussions can be remarkably illuminating in many respects, because I think the framework for many archaeologists is place or thing oriented, right? And we spend a lot of time talking about objects, tools, the specific places on the landscape where they're found. And it strikes me in working with many of the tribal representatives that the perspective that you're voicing is often very different in terms of the connections and significance of places. Is that something you can touch on?
Sure. I have this conversation with my colleague, Dr. Craig Zappola, who co-directs our field school with us. We often talk about removing the human from the center of our research, which kind of sounds maybe counterintuitive, seeing that archaeology is basically the study of man and of human. But for us at Mohegan, it's a relational. We are part of a larger web of relations. We are not the center of all activity. So the way we approach a landscape, perhaps, or places that we hold ceremony to keep balance between all things, you might not necessarily find many artifacts at such a site. And we avoid using the term sterile in our work that we do, because sterile denotes a devoid of purpose or meaning. So for us, many times the landscape itself is the site. And you don't tend to leave tools, or you don't make tools or process animals at ceremonial places and important sacred places as such. Excuse me. So that's one way in which we approach landscapes, more so than site by site artifact, and relying on artifacts that we find in places. And our oral tradition and histories tell us where these places are, why they're important. So we don't necessarily need to go and excavate because there's no real data there that's going to really highlight or give us any more information than we really need to know about the place. And we respect these places, so as we all know, archaeology is a destructive field, and so once you start to impact sites, it's no longer the same. So that's one way we avoid sites that sacred places and things like that.
It also, and I'm thinking about a number of conversations past, and of course many of these things are linked in my mind whenever we're talking about these topics. But another friend and a colleague from another southeastern Connecticut tribe, after a lengthy presentation by archaeologists about where we expect to find things, why we expect to find things there, what the ancient landscape might have looked like, where food was available, paused momentarily and just said, there are many places that are important to us and that were very important to our ancestors that don't have anything to do with the food quest. In other words, we're more than just our economies. And it's moments like that, those comments like that, that are striking for an archaeologist, because it's not until your nose is sort of pointed in the right direction you realize just how much it is that we often focus on those what we think of as pragmatic or predictable elements in there. And so, touching on something you just mentioned, James, about sacred places, one of the other things for archaeologists is we're often dividing things into practical areas of human experience, and whatever's left oftentimes is attributed to quote-unquote cultural factors or ceremony or ceremonial practice. And that's another matter that it's often been pointed out to me is very different from many of the tribe's own conceptions of their relationships in the world they lived in and the way their ancestors lived. Is that something that strikes you in working with archaeologists? Because I know you work collaboratively with many archaeologists that you've done research with for many generations or for many years, but you also interact with a lot of other archaeologists.
Yeah, for me, I would say that the difference between a non-Indigenous archaeologist and potentially a tribal archaeologist is understanding the difference in approach and the difference of theory or constructing different methodologies. Tribal forums are really, they put value as to the culture within that sometimes are absent in non-Indigenous archaeologists. And so that perspective is often very, very different. When it comes to archaeology from a tribal perspective, for me personally, it has to do a lot with the past and connecting to our history. And what is history? It's ultimately about power. And when we talk about history, it ultimately means that archaeologists, whether they're tribal or non-Indigenous, have a lot of power and can shape what's being written down and how people learn and how our communities are being educated in that sense. And to have two different forms of knowing coming together, I think is a great way to understand a particular scenario or parcel of land, for instance, in the most comprehensive way possible.
I think that's a great point, because I often feel that archaeology has been used and is used to separate us from our past. These neat little boxes of time periods of the Paleo, the Archaic, the Late Archaic. These all carry tremendous power with them, as you mentioned. We feel that those are our ancestors, and I've often felt that, as I said, the field has been used kind of to separate us from that. So I think that's a great point you're making.
Yeah, no, and I think that there's a continuation as far as tribal thought. There's no disconnect, and a lot of times with archaeology, it does kind of pit you into boxes or separating different time periods where, from our perspective, that doesn't occur. Something that has happened in the past, we still experience today. The Pequot War, for instance, yes, it was a very, very long time ago, but we do see the impacts or the results of that in our people still today. And so when archaeologists, through whatever fashion, are conducting archaeology, realizing that there is a human side attached to that. And so when you're you're digging into that history, realizing and understanding the history as far as what takes place in war and the impacts of that to a society.
I think that's another great point, Marissa, is that the past is never in the past, as they say. At least that's how we view the past. It's alive, it's breathing, it's with us today. So that's another great point.
Absolutely.
Excellent. This is a really fantastic discussion. So one of the other...
I think why don't we go to break, and we'll be back with more interesting discussion here with our guest.
Ever wonder what it was like to serve on board a World War II submarine? What life was like for the submariners who dedicated their service to America under the waves? Come see and experience it all at the Submarine Force Museum in Groton, Connecticut. Enter the first nuclear submarine America made, the USS Nautilus, and see where these brave men served. See where they slept, worked, ate, and lived together for seemingly endless time underwater. Look through the periscope of the past and find everything you wanted to know about submarines in the museum's vast collection of artifacts and documents. Go to ussnautilus.org for information on new exhibits, special events, and educational opportunities, or to schedule a group tour. The best part about the Submarine Force Museum is that it's completely free. Bring the family and explore the wonders of submarine life and learn the history of America's story past and life beneath the waves. The Submarine Force Museum, Crystal Lake Road, Groton, and online at ussnautilus.org. And remember, it's free.
Hi, I'm Vin Capice, President and CEO of the new Middlesex Health. Today, Middlesex has grown into much more than just a hospital. With locations throughout central Connecticut and the shoreline, we offer compassionate care, exceptional service, and expertise in almost every medical specialty, from cancer treatment and advanced surgery to primary care, physical rehab, and more. Visit middlesexhealth.org to see why we are today's smarter choice for care.
Welcome back to Archaeology of Connecticut, and I think that this has been fascinating so far, and I'd like to continue our conversation. And Dan, where are we going with this next?
So I'm hoping we can step back for a moment and talk a little bit about our personal histories for how we actually got involved and whether there is a moment. So for many archaeologists, there's a moment in which the light bulb went off and they thought, okay, this is something I can do, or this is something that really fascinates me. And for each of us, it's a personal journey of some sort. So were there moments for you when, as you were coming up, when you felt yourself funneled towards this education and preservation and cultural role within your tribes? So Marissa, why don't we start with you?
Absolutely. For me, my background, ultimately growing up on the reservation in Connecticut, as well as having a casino, the reaction from the public as a Pequot person was very challenging for me personally, and I'm assuming a lot of our tribal membership. And through that, we were able to see a lot of injustices in our community. And through that, as a child growing up in that environment, I questioned why that was taking place, why certain notions or conceptions of Pequot people were the way that they were presenting them. And so it really challenged me to seek education in the area of Indigenous law, with the understanding that in order to protect and to preserve certain aspects of our culture so that it moves forward, we really have to understand the society and the rules that are implemented in order to be able to protect these places. And ultimately, it rests really on the extreme amount of injustice or marginalization, I would say, that you experience from a very early time period. And through that, watching large development projects, I would say, transpire on the reservation, trying to best understand how to move forward, how to balance development and continuing on as a nation with the ability to remain true to ourselves and to preserve our most significant locations in that. And having those questions ultimately led me to this position, I would say.
For myself, my first memories are, Tentaquidgeon Museum up on Church Lane in Mohegan Hill, visiting there as a small child. My great-grandmother was Lillian Tentaquidgeon, sister of Harold and Gladys. So growing up around those stories, growing up with Harold and Gladys, having the opportunity to speak with them, to see the work they did in preserving the tribe's history. Harold was a big advocate for educating our non-native neighbors. One of his favorite sayings was, "It's hard to hate somebody you know." So, kind of carrying on that tradition, I often feel that I particularly didn't choose the path I'm on. Sometimes I feel like I was kind of pulled into it and drawn into it by just growing up around that and understanding the importance of the work they were doing, and just being a great admirer of the work Gladys did, becoming a native anthropologist and working with Frank Speck, and that sense of pride in preserving our history and our heritage really just resonated with me. And I started this path a little later in life, but I'm happy to be where I'm at now and engage in work and carry on that important work that was started so long ago. So it's really an honor, and like I said, I think I was more drawn to it or pulled to it rather than I kind of chose this path on my own.
Excellent. Do either of you have you had those with any work of the sort that you do? There are always moments that you feel great victories, and then there are those awful moments where you realize you didn't necessarily accomplish what you were hoping to. And sometimes that can have a real emotional impact. It certainly does from every archaeologist I know. Are there moments that you can identify?
Well, in terms of the work of being a THPO, every site we lose, and we lose them often, is a little piece of my heart that's gone as well. So, as Native people, we've lost so much through time, and that part of the job can be very taxing, because you're actually making decisions and agreeing to impact these sites directly for good, and so having to actually have a part in that, and you're on record saying, okay, let's go ahead with this mitigation plan, when in your heart you're saying, can't we just leave it alone? So those are kind of those, that's almost a regular occurrence in most of the projects we review for federalized projects, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, I would say a lot of the projects, especially off-reservation, are very challenging because it may be an area that is very important to us. And we can only do as much as the law or regulation allows us to do. And that is quite frustrating, knowing that there's only so much you can do. As a THPO, I find that we can provide commentary, we can provide our thoughts on the matter, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that is taken into consideration or the way that we would like it to go. And as James was just saying, our history really is prone to a lot of trauma, a lot of taking from our people, and that continues today. And destroying a site, or even just disturbing a certain area that may not need to be disturbed from a tribal perspective, is another form of taking. And so that participating in that type of action actively is very challenging. Also, when you come in contact in certain instances with human remains and NAGPRA is triggered, then it's a whole different area where the job from that perspective is not challenging, but it is emotionally challenging in that sense, because you have to deal with remains. And again, even though we're talking about archaeology, that equates to basic human rights to me in that sense. And so when you come to the realization of being in the year 2019, but Native people are still fighting for very basic human rights, that was a shock to me coming into this position, really realizing in the active sense that we are very much viewed as property under cultural resource law, and to realize that humans and objects are still viewed as property, and that we're not afforded the same rights as other individuals, can take its toll on us.
With NAGPRA, have you seen improvements in the archaeological community, the non-indigenous, and also in the general public, or do you think that we're still kind of spinning our wheels?
Yeah, I think that, cultural resource law, NAGPRA, very much so in particular, they're very loosely written from my perspective, and they were loosely written so that they're open to interpretation. And when you leave something open to interpretation, it can go in many different ways, and it also leaves different parties quite confused as to what to do. So you have museums, different institutions, universities that are trying to apply and implement NAGPRA to do the right thing, but may not necessarily understand how to do that because the law doesn't make it very clear. And it's the same on the tribal side as well. So
right, and that process is driven by institutions and museums as well. So it's at their pace, how they conduct it. Some are more conducive to more open to the process. Some are still dragging their feet. I believe a lot of these institutions feel that they have a proprietary. They think they take ownership of these things, and they think that these are their things now. And that's especially problematic with remains, as you can imagine. So it is a difficult process, one that wasn't developed by tribes, and I don't think with much tribal input. So it's a process we've had to learn to work with, and it's really case by case. It really depends on mostly individuals at these places developing relationships, but it's a very difficult process to navigate for sure.
yeah, and I was going to say that I think ownership is key to all of this. What I find throughout this work is you're dealing with the question of who owns the past. And when it comes to our history, it's very important to make sure that we're communicating with the community that we are researching, as well as giving back, reporting back that information to the tribal community so they can put that at use.
And this kind of brings us back to where we started this episode. So for many of our listeners, it's quite possible they didn't question who the authoritative voice is in talking about the indigenous past of Connecticut or any other region. And I think it's quite common for people to turn to archaeologists because we are researching those topics. So that tension, right, which comes up frequently when we all interact with each other, how would you advise? Or do you have thoughts that you'd like to share for archaeologists, whether avocational archaeologists, academic archaeologists, professional archaeologists, for how you would like things to work and how we can be more inclusive in terms of speaking about the past?
Well, one thing is being open-minded and willing to accept that there are other ways of knowing the past than what you may have studied or been taught. We often find that oral history and traditions take a back seat or get paid lip service. For us, though, because they're not thought of scientific or data-driven, but for us, at least for me, what I was taught, my oral tradition and stories that I was told, they're all embedded with lessons about the environment, about seasonality, about weather, about landscapes, about rivers. I mean, it just it's loaded with all kinds of information that tell us who we are and our place in the world. So in that respect, it is scientific to us. There's astronomy. There is science built into our oral traditions. So it's important to understand that indigenous people relied on this method for centuries and thousands of years, and so we do have a way of knowing the past that may not be in line with what you're taught.
Yeah, and ultimately when there are alternative histories, you're going to have alternative discussions that lead you to a better understanding of the past all-inclusively. One of the questions that we always ask if archaeology is going to be conducted is, how does this benefit the tribal community? So if we're unable to precisely answer that question, then we step back and question whether or not the archaeological research for that is something that we should move forward with. So ultimately, just for archaeologists and researchers to understand that we are a people, we're a living people, and we're very much connected to our past, and to research the past of a tribal community, it's very important to interact with that community and to gain their perspective and just to be open to whatever is being discussed at that moment.
This makes me think of a great Native scholar and author, Vine Delora Jr. He stated that there's no one group that is responsible for basically surveying the totality of knowledge that we have and putting into a simple explanation for the rest of society to understand. So that's not responsibility of one group. There are many groups out there, and I think it's the melding of all these different ways of knowing the past that are going to create a more complete version of it. So I think that's a highly important thing. It's just when you approach tribes, I think the open mind, being open-minded, and that works both ways. Tribes can be a little more open-minded as well, but that's as we mentioned, the trauma and the history of archaeology in this country. It starts basically with grave robbing. So it takes a lot of movement on both ends, but I think that's.
Yeah, it has to have trust, and because of the history, the trust has somewhat broken down. In other areas, it has not. But acknowledging those differences, I think that's a good place to start, and to still come to the table and to have those difficult discussions, and realizing that we are coming from different places and we have different belief systems, but ultimately, as THPO offices, we know that we're all just looking to preserve these places for the communities at large.
And that's really the main focus of our field school as well, to create that kind of third space, if you will, to offer a place for disparate people, diverse people to come together and discuss this, these differing viewpoints and these differing worldviews, and to feel comfortable about exposing these conflicts and discussing them in a setting like that.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges that we frequently face, archaeologists frequently face, is the opportunities that we have or that we take advantage of to talk to each other. We're often in a very specific circumstance with a specific schedule or timeline that we're all facing, and that's not the most conducive setting for building trust or establishing those relationships. And I think to the extent that relationship really matters here, not just between groups, but at an individual level, and that you demonstrate good faith over time, and you're not always going to succeed. Recognizing that it's really hard to do that if 90% of your conversations are about a very specific place or a very specific project for it. And so those opportunities, like you mentioned, James, for the field school or other settings where there is more free conversation and there is a chance to discuss some of the difficult issues that can separate archaeologists and indigenous peoples in general. That can be a real challenge for all of us.
Yeah, I mean, even as an undergrad at UConn, the history of archaeology wasn't necessarily taught. It was, kind of glossed over, and kind of, I don't want to use a term, but it was kind of, it was
still very Eurocentric.
Yeah, very Eurocentric, yes, we'll say that. And so, and coming from a place where I came from and, expecting to see maybe a little bit more, and I'm not sure how the program is now or what students are taught these days, so that's why we feel our field school is very important, because we feel like maybe they're still not getting that message.
Yeah, and I would make the point that there's an entire generation of archaeologists who have come up through the programs managed and operated by both of your tribes, and not just Mashantucket and Mohegan, but Eastern Pequot is a very active program.
Fantastic field school.
So they are training an entire generation, new generations of archaeologists who are working in a much more sort of collaborative framework.
Right, and not just thinking about the work, the data collection, but why we do it, how we do it. Having that conversation, that running dialogue throughout it. And really, like I said, exposing those hurtful that hurtful past or that trauma in the past.
Yeah, and I think that archaeology, as of today, you can use archaeology to frame and ask questions that the tribal community may have, that archaeology may be able to assist by providing physical evidence to help something that's taking place currently today.
All right, I think we're going to take a break real quick here before we go into the home stretch, so stay tuned.
Come to Hillstead Museum in Farmington, Connecticut to experience art and culture in a magnificent historic setting. A visit to Hillstead Museum unlocks a 1901 architectural treasure. French Impressionist paintings, Ming Dynasty Chinese porcelain, Japanese woodblock prints and period furnishings. Enjoy a guided tour with interpreters who have the inside scoop on the family that created this landmark. Take time to experience the tranquility of Hillstead's sunken garden, or take in surrounding vistas of the Litchfield Hills while sitting on the Mount Vernon-inspired veranda. There is something for everyone at Hillstead in Farmington. Bring your friends and family to one of our many public programs, such as the Sunken Garden Poetry Festival, May Market, Heyday, or Holiday Boutique. Find a complete schedule of events at hillstead.org. Visit Hillstead Museum to take a step back in time, explore nature, or marvel at world-class artwork by Monet, Degas, Cassatt, Manet, and Whistler. There is so much to discover only at Hillstead. Please visit hillstead.org.
Hi, this is Tony Marino, Executive Director of the Rockfall Foundation. If you don't know, Rockfall is 83 years old and is one of Connecticut's longest-serving environmental organizations. We support environmental education and programming and are working to make the lower Connecticut River Valley a healthier and more sustainable place. That includes grant funding to organizations to support their environmental programs, managing the historic DeCoven House in Middletown, providing affordable office space, and community meeting space to environmental organizations. You can learn more about the work of the Rockfall Foundation at rockfallfoundation.org. And if you aren't already, please consider becoming a member. Members make our work possible, and I thank you very much.
Hi, Scott Brady, welcoming you back to Archaeology in Connecticut, and let's continue this conversation.
So, Marissa, if I can, I want to pick up where we just left off. We're talking about how archaeologists can assist in looking for physical evidence of events or other matters that are of interest to the tribes. This is, I think, for many archaeologists, one of the fundamental challenges that we face is in that setting, asking an archaeologist to seek physical evidence can be a very risky prospect, because if we don't find physical evidence, or we find physical evidence that's very different from what you may have expected, we're in a bind. Right, and from an abstract perspective, it's not a bind. It is what it is, right? So, quote unquote, the data speaks for itself. That's not the nature of the discussions that we're often engaged in, and I think it is an important aspect of this is that archaeologists are very uneasy, if not fully queasy, about the idea of trying to evaluate traditions or beliefs about things that occurred in particular places, because it does pose the risk that we're going to find something very different and have to navigate those results. And I think it's an important aspect of what we do. There's no completely avoiding that, but it is a very important part of the complexity that we all engage in when we're talking about specific issues or specific places, and how we understand those places.
Yeah, absolutely. I find as though that's absolutely accurate, and we can hope to locate or identify certain locations, and physical evidence. Ultimately, archaeology is very much just part of a small portion of a much larger picture. And our community members, our oral traditions, our elders, they very much provide additional sources of information. A site may be significant, or a sacred property may be sacred, but may not have any physical evidence associated with it, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it has no significance to the tribes.
All right, so I'm going to step back here, and so I'll share one comment. Brian Jones, when the show was first being conceptualized, would attract archaeologists to come to the show by calling it our Dungeons and Dragons, right? So his perspective was this is a rare opportunity for archaeologists to get into the details and into the weeds on many of the issues that we feel very important, even if they're not necessarily immediately obvious to a lot of other people. But a lot of what we're doing there are a broad swath of the public that has a real interest in the past and understanding more about it. And so those personal connections that we have to not just the past, but how we learn about the past, we all vary a little bit in how we connect to that. I will use the example again of Brian as a dear friend and somebody I knew for a very long time. One of the avenues that Brian found most rewarding in the work over the whole course of his career was working with children, right? That was showing kids archaeology, what you could do with archaeology, how it's done, and the challenge of the puzzle.
Sure.
How do you solve this puzzle? How do you learn about that? And it's a physical activity. There's a huge tactile element to this. But Brian was able to work with children in a way that was very engaging and was incredibly rewarding to him. And are there experiences that you've had, not necessarily with children, but with other groups, either within your tribe or outside your tribe, that you can connect to in a similar way, or that you found in particular very rewarding in the work that you're doing?
Most recently, we, in the last year or so, have been consulting on a project in the city of Norwalk. And there's a very significant village identified there. And those people, the Norwalk people, are no longer here. So I think that's an instance where connecting the public to this space, to those people, brings them back out of the shadows of history. And you get to know more about those people that were there. They were, and the fact that they were there and they're no longer there, and kind of examining the difficult parts of our history and kind of giving people that understanding and opening up to, and because, many people may not know who the Norwalk people were.
Right, so how do you share that? Right, so we've learned a lot from those excavations, the research associated, and a lot of the input from the tribes. How do you share that in a way that engages the public in exactly that part of the history, right? So there is a people that in some sense were lost physically.
Physically, yes.
Right, but they live on in many respects. How do you convey that to the public?
Well, I think in this instance, I believe the city's been very proactive and progressive with their approach and wanting to share this information with the public, and I think that's a great example of working with a city or a public with the public to bring this education forward. So I think that's just like I said, I think it's a really wonderful thing that the city's been trying to do there, because they've been really invested in this project and trying to educate their city. They're very proud of trying to, and they want to tell this story, which I think is fantastic. So that's not often the case, especially in federal projects, but this instance really represents a great example of an opportunity to bring people out of, like I said, to educate people.
Excellent. And we're always happy to give kudos wherever we can,
absolutely.
Especially to parties you don't necessarily expect it from
Absolutely.
when you first arrive
Absolutely.
on the scene. So
Absolutely.
that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Marissa, do you?
I would say the one positive aspect of archaeology, in the sense of for federal projects, a lot of areas are disturbed, which can be frustrating in certain scenarios, but through mitigation, we often see it end in some form of educational format, and so that's always nice to be able to gather all of the data and material that came out of the archaeology, and to put together a education program for the public, as well as tribal members, the tribal community, everyone as a whole, to really utilize that, whether it's a classroom program, a exhibit at a museum that everyone can go and attend and kind of learn from. There are many different facets or ways that we take the archaeology and turn it into education that's accessible to almost everyone from different areas and different ages.
It's a very fine line to walk. It's almost a case-by-case, site-by-site consideration. My goal is preservation first. Public access is never really high on my list of priorities when it comes to when I come into these projects. But in some situations, like I just mentioned, it is very useful and very useful.
And I think this is a topic where there's a different challenge in trying to share with the public information, but how to protect these places. And this is something I know FOSA has confronted quite a bit as well, is vandalism, looting, damage to Connecticut's archaeological or other cultural sites is a huge issue. It's an enormous challenge, and it is a kind of a brick wall in many ways in terms of sharing information with the public.
Yeah, this just this year, earlier in the spring, Brian was out at a site on a conservation piece of conserved land that, they had built 2x4 screens in the woods and had excavated an area in a midden the size of a football field. Yeah. So there is a lot of insensitivity, or at least insensitivity, maybe worse.
I believe I visited that site with Brian and was involved with that. Yeah, it's very sad, and that does go on. And that's why preservation is first, because a lot of these traditional cultural properties as well and sacred places, Native people are still going there to do ceremony, and so when you open that to public scrutiny, maybe they're less apt to want to go to these places and experience them as their ancestors did. So it's a very fine line. It really is.
Right. And I think for many people who have not engaged in these types of discussions in the past, it is surprising to hear that they may not anticipate that there's certain types of knowledge that really can't be shared.
Right.
Or they can only be shared under very specific circumstances. And because that is not the sort of framework people expect when they sit down to talk about an issue. And that can be, I'm sure, challenging, certainly for the tribes. It can be very challenging for everybody else at the table at those moments.
Yes, very often I have to say, I can't really share that with you, like you just said. Very often that's the answer I have to give, because I'm not the person to be sharing that information. Certain people are only certain people can share certain information. That's just kind of the way we've always been. And it goes back to loss. Controlling that information is crucial to protecting these places.
And a related issue, which it can be very difficult to navigate at times, are concerns about the repercussions of certain things, including archaeology, in certain settings. That it's not just disrespectful or even offensive, but that there's a risk to the health, that there are real risks involved with certain things occurring. And, when you bring those concerns into, say, a regulatory environment, not surprisingly, the bureaucratic system can have a very hard time reconciling some of those beliefs and understanding how to appropriately address those.
I think a great example is the work we've been doing with ceremonial stone landscapes over the last, 10 years or so. That has been a long road getting agencies and archaeologists to understand the importance of these places, and that that's where they are preserving. And looking at it from a cultural landscape perspective, the problem with CRM work is you're getting you get the right of way, and you get this very little sliver of so you're really fragmenting history, really fragmenting the record, and so that can be a really difficult thing.
And I think this is probably a good place for us to sort of wrap our hands around this conversation, which is always, as is typical for us, is sprawled a little bit.
Sure.
But when we are thinking about moving forward, are there specific steps that archaeologists and indigenous people can do together that makes our work together more effective and rewarding? So, another way to think about this is, are there specific questions that we archaeologists are often ignoring that you feel are important, that we should be thinking about more? Or there are specific things that we should be thinking about when we engage with indigenous people or indigenous researchers in the work that we do?
I would say that the relationship is certainly important. I believe having a reciprocal relationship is, key in that, because there are many relationships, and relationships are important, but it is very important for it to go both ways. And so as an archaeologist may be taking the sharing of that knowledge, and again, reporting back to the community, I think will assist the community in appreciating the archaeology to its full extent versus just feeling something that has been removed, that we're not exactly sure how it helps or benefits our community. I have a few critical questions that we always kind of go through, and I'll just read them. But to ask the question of whose research is it, who owns it, whose interest does it serve, who will benefit from it, who has designed its questions and framed its scope, who will carry it out, who will write it, and how will the results be disseminated. And I think those are all critical questions to ask for any archaeologist.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think as a student of archaeology or somebody who's looking to come into this field, I think it's important to understand that history and the power dynamics of the history of archaeology and how this all began. And so having an appreciation of how archaeology has affected Native communities throughout its history is important as well. And so I think that's really, and just being open. I think collaboration does go both ways. It's a two-way conversation, but oftentimes that conversation doesn't come from one side. It's just kind of, the openness isn't really coming from one side. It's kind of being told this is what's happening or this is what happened. So I think just understanding and respecting that Native people understand their history a lot better than I think we get acknowledged for.
Dan, final thoughts? I know we're rapidly closing to the end of our hour.
So first, I just really want to thank James and Marissa for coming in.
They were
This
great.
has been a
Thank you very
fascinating
much.
discussion and a really important one, and one that has additional chapters in the future that we need to follow up on.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
both
you all
very
very
much.
Yeah, and this is Archaeology in Connecticut. That's our show for this month, and hopefully you'll join us next month. Take care.